and take over the introduction.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our last meeting in this feature speaker series with Professor Hans Auer today, where we will discuss the European Green Deal and the challenges on the ground. Europe sees itself as a role model for the rest of the world in the transition away from fossil fuels. Climate change and environmental degradation are perceived as an existential threat to Europe and the world. The European Green Deal was presented on December 11, 2019, and includes a set of policy initiatives to make the European Union climate neutral by 2050. The European Commission has adopted a set of proposals to make the EU's climate, energy, transport, and taxation policies fit for reducing net greenhouse gas emissions by at least 55% by 2030, compared to the 1990 levels. Climate action, the circular economy, environmental protection, biodiversity, forest management, an industrial plan, and climate law, as well as several supporting legislative changes to support these goals, are the key elements of the EU Green Deal. Against the backdrop of the COVID-19 pandemic and the ensuing supply chain disruptions, as well as the Russia-Ukraine war, several new regulations and policies have been adopted. I would like to welcome our featured speaker today, Professor Hans Auer. Professor Hans Auer has led the Energy Economics Group at the Vienna Technical University in Austria since 2024. He is an associate professor in energy systems economics. He also holds an adjunct position as international chair in the Energy Transitions Program at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology. Since joining the Energy Economics Group in 1995, his work has focused on energy market design and renewable integration. He has coordinated numerous European research projects, and his research is published widely. Welcome, Professor Hans Auer.
Welcome, everybody. Okay, so you hear me?
Yes, I hear you.
Perfect. Perfect. So it's really a pleasure to contribute today to this, let's say, very important topic for us in Europe. So I can imagine that in the audience there are many energy experts there. So being from outside Europe and hopefully, so with my contribution, so you might get a little bit of better understanding about our challenges ahead.
Yes.
So,
Go ahead.
Okay, so Isabel asked me to elaborate, let's say, a little bit about, let's say, at the very beginning about decision making. Let's say in Europe. So who in Europe formulates the ideas? Who finally makes the decisions? And how are these energy policy or energy and climate related policy decisions are finally implemented? So now when talking, let's say, about let's say the Green Deal having been implemented in 2019 and all the let's say associated then documents up to today, or even let's say the planned let's say directives in the years to come. So before talking about that, so I would go back, let's say about 25 years ago. So it was in 1999 when in Europe we implemented the directives to implement, let's say, markets or energy markets. And it all the time works or still worked and still works similar. So after, of course, some informal discussions with, let's say, national bodies and stakeholders and the associations. Many of them are, let's say, hosted in Brussels, so the associations of the important, let's say, stakeholder groups. So after these kind of formal discussions, usually there is a top-down approach where the European Commission implements some, let's say, directives and regulations. So this is more or less, let's say, the big cornerstones and the targets and the target years. What's supposed to be, let's say, the ambition or the European ambition, and what should be reached. And then usually this has to be implemented into national law. It needs to be aligned, of course, in the different member states with legislation there. And in Europe, we have historically quite a diverse, let's say, understanding of industrial, let's say, policies and politics. So just to mention two, maybe countries, let's say, showing the bandwidth. On the one hand, the UK. So this is, of course, the much more, let's say, market oriented kind of industry policy. And on the other hand, for instance, it was and is still France, where, let's say, the public service aspect and let's say the role of the state is maybe more dominant, also in terms of ownership of, let's say, companies and stakeholders and so on. But usually then, of course, it works like that these directives, they have to be implemented and the instruments. So they are all the time a little bit different kind of instruments. They have to be aligned with national, let's say, legislation and regulations. And this is also how it works, let's say, in the electricity markets or the gas markets. And then there is all the time, of course, frequent feedback loops with the European Commission, where things are, or where we try, or Europe tries to improve efficiency and effectiveness, let's say, of the different instruments. And what's also very important in Europe is the sovereignty in the energy business of the technology mix. So this is so we had again, when talking about the electricity system or the electricity markets, so we have on the one hand countries again like France being dominated by nuclear power plant fleet. Other countries they don't have nuclear at all, and so on. And this, let's say, kind of technology decision is taken in the member states. So there is no let's say, no top-down power, let's say, from the European Commission.
Yes, I think this is one of the misconceptions of people outside the EU. They think that it's a very centralized decision making. But whereas certain things, like you just mentioned, are centralized, others are really not. Hans, we would like to ask you, we got a few questions. If you can turn on your camera, can you try one more time?
Are you sharing slides now? We can see that. So I have not prepared slide for today's meeting or for the discussion in this hour. So there was this question, because sometimes it's a little bit misleading that we then only, let's say, have a look on a few, let's say, details in a slide. Also, I want to bring much more, let's say, a bigger picture. So how the situation in Europe is.
Yes.
Yeah,
no, I meant more if you can try to see if your camera is working again.
Yeah.
That would be great if we could see
unfortunately not. Otherwise, I don't know if this gives sense to restart the meeting, but then we lose 5 minutes or so.
Yes. No, I don't think.
Because I can let's say try with the old equipment, and then most probably it works. But I don't think it gives much sense to
Okay,
lose
yes.
these 5 minutes. Yeah.
Okay. Let's ask Julie what she thinks, but if she agrees, then we will just keep it this way. Okay, so do you have anything more about this first question, or should we go, because I interrupted you, or should we go to the next question? It's up to you.
Yeah, so I want to elaborate a little bit more now about the first question. So because now I want to start with the Green Deal. It was in 2019, and it defined this 55% goal in 2030 and so on. But then all the time we had some kind of back and forth, because then we realized, okay, we need also, let's say, some kind of alignment in terms of green finance, and then we had the discussion on the taxonomy. So how to get access to the capital markets, and in this context, I will talk later about the Draghi report in this context again, because we have extremely fragmented financial markets. So we also need to facilitate, let's say, the merger of European corporations. We have to amend the banking sector and so on. So all these subsequent, let's say, challenges and questions then have been, let's say, have come on stage. So with the Green Deal. Then we had, of course, in 2022, after the invasion of Ukraine, a new situation, a disruption, also in terms of also gas supply, and based on that, Repower EU was implemented, even much more ambitious, let's say, kind of, or acceleration of energy transition and decarbonization. Then in Europe, we also had to react on the US Inflation Reduction Act. So here we then implemented the Green Industrial Deal, but this was a reaction, let's say, of developments outside, so in the US, but also in China. So the subsidy of the industries and so on, and then we went ahead with the Net Zero Industrial Act. Now we are talking about the Critical Raw Material Act, but all these kind of, let's say, policies, the big cornerstones and the targets, the percentages we should reach in a certain target year, 2030, 40, or 50, are defined, let's say, more or less in Brussels, and then we have to react on that. And also, let's say, this initiative of the emission trading scheme. So this is the first international emission trading scheme we have since 2005 in Europe. And this, of course, is let's say, a significant, let's say, burden to the European industry. So we all know this increases energy, electricity prices, and so on. And here we have many challenges. Let's say in this context, we will also address it then in subsequent questions. So from Isabel. So maybe you can go ahead.
Sure, my pleasure. So these are already some very interesting insights that you presented. And where do you see the major stumbling blocks to a successful transition to a more sustainable energy mix? Why haven't things worked more successfully so far, as businesses are leaving and producing in countries with less rules and regulations and cheaper energy costs? It seems as if the energy transition speeds up EU deindustrialization and is destroying the European industrial powerhouse. Is that a correct statement, or is it wrong? What would you say about these things? You addressed some of them already a little bit, so I let you go.
Yeah, so I addressed a few of them a little bit. So on the one hand, of course, it is the European policy decision of the European Commission, let's say, to decarbonize, to reach a certain, let's say, decarbonization goals. And then, of course, in countries, or let's mention Germany, They also in the past and still have, but in the past had significant shares of coal. So they published plans to phase out from coal, and then they even they implemented an even more ambitious, let's say, plan. And then, of course, you have big challenges because there are some regions where, let's say, GDP in the past was generated based on fossil fuel, let's say, energy production. And then you have to, let's say, to think about, let's say, compensation in this region. And in Germany, for instance, there have been 40 billions of euros on structural funds to, let's say, to compensate for this accelerated coal phase out. And this, on the one hand, led to unemployment, and it's very difficult in our areas. So for the 50 plus generation to find a new job anymore. So this is also a big challenge in Europe, a big social problem that, let's say, with our let's say, wages, and there are many taxes, charges, surcharges, and so on, that employees, elder employees, that they are, let's say, very expensive, and our industries or our society has problems to offer, let's say, adequate jobs, and then you end up in, let's say, unemployment or even earlier retirement than expected, and so on. So these, for instance, is a structural problem. This has, let's say, a priori now nothing to do with energy prices. But on the other hand, of course, also, let's say, with our ambitions and higher energy prices, we also struggle a little bit. So for instance, in one study, which says that a 10% increase of electricity prices increases unemployment in energy-intensive sectors by 2%. And percentages, and this explains also, let's say, the decline, of course, of GDP, and also the increase of unemployment in the energy intensive sectors
Yes.
in certain European regions.
Hans, I just heard back.
Yeah,
I just heard back from the IAEE executive director, and she would like us to pause the video so that you can try the other equipment and come on camera, because apparently I'm the only one who is showing up on the webinar, so which is kind of a little bit awkward. So to everyone, we're sorry about these technical difficulties, but we're going to pause the webinar and come back.
Yeah, okay.
They put me on there with your voice. It's horrible.
Yeah.
Oh, recording in progress. So can we continue now?
Please.
Okay, great. So welcome again, Hans, and we're happy to see you on the screen right now. So I think we were in the middle of question 2, where you talked about, the long-term, the effect of the long-term higher energy prices on unemployment in Germany, and the direct and indirect effects on unemployment here. Maybe you can elaborate and continue from there. And then maybe talk about a few takeaways on the financial side, on the financial side or innovation side from the Draghi report.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So as I said, it's not necessarily, let's say, the high energy prices who triggered this, let's say, structural problem, because we had some regions where simply majority of the workforce is worked, let's say, in coal mining and so on, and in this sector, and this was a policy decision to phase out at a certain point, or then even faster. But as I said, also, of course, higher energy prices then lead to some further, let's say, decrease in GDPs, increase in unemployment and deindustrialization, of course. And the challenge is to create a high quality job, let's say, forward looking, promising kind of new fields. But as I said, so it's very difficult, let's say, for the 50 plus generation to find a job at all. And in addition to that, all the time the European Commission tries to respond. Also, let's say, with the implementation of our emission trading, let's say, schemes, we have now they responded with the cross-border adjustment mechanisms, so that products and goods being imported to Europe, that they are also, let's say, more or less treated equally compared to our, let's say, domestic kind of products. So this is, of course, how Europe wants to, let's say, implement some kind of fair conditions also for the domestic industries. So this is, for instance, one instrument being amended now also so this year, and where Europe tries also to, let's say, incentivize other regions, let's say, to follow their, let's say, role model, because to some extent Europe wants to show as some kind of a living laboratory, let's say, how decarbonization could work. But with all the challenges we are discussing right now. And when talking about, let's say, the Excel or our homework to be done. So this is written in the Draghi report. So Mario Draghi was, let's say, the director of the European Central Bank, and he was consulted, let's say, to deliver now his expertise, how competitiveness and growth, economic growth, in Europe could be, let's say, not only maintained, but let's say even better implemented than in the past. And there is a lot to do. So it's not only, let's say, boosting innovation in the energy technology sector, but it's mainly about combining many policies, the trade, foreign policies, tax policies, and also to let's say, to much more incentivize financing instruments, reduce the fragmentation of the capital markets, reforming decision making, and of course, significantly reducing bureaucracy and regulation. So it's really sometimes annoying, and it's not necessarily European regulations or top-down coming from Brussels. So it's then the details of the national legislations and the implementation of certain rules. So there is a significant, let's say, potential to accelerate, let's say, implementation of new regulations.
Can you tell us a little bit more detail about the cross-border adjustment, if possible? And also, we had a comment more than a question saying maybe it should also be noted that the European ETS scheme, which added the prices of CO2 allowances to the generation cost, also contributed to the high prices of coal-generated electricity. Of course, that applies, I think, to all, forms of conventional energy. Right?
Yes, yeah. This applies to all, let's say, CO2 emitting or let's say, kind of energies, and of course, this significantly the CO2 prices significantly increased it. But when explaining, so we started in 2005, and now we are already in the fourth period of emission trading, so 21 to 2030. And in the past, so in the last 15 years, so there was a free allocation, and it was, let's say, generous. So in those days, there have been, or the trading quantities have been rather let's say, low, and also the CO2 prices. But now in the fourth period, there have been many amendments. Also, several sectors are covered, not only the industry and the energy sector, but also now implicit, or the transport sector, and also implicitly the household. So if you buy fossil fuels, also let's say the CO2 price signal is already there in the, let's say, wholesale markets everywhere, and now there is also, or the amount of certificates is continuously then reduced, that you let's say show scarcity, and that you foster innovation and so on. But this is, of course, an additional let's say burden in Europe compared to other regions, and therefore this cross-border adjustment mechanism seriously wants to be implemented. This is simply kind of, let's say, now a burden, let's say, for the regions outside Europe, simply to deliver their goods and products and to sell them in Europe. And in that respect, the European Commission wants to, let's say, trigger some kind of fair global trade, simply speaking.
But it's going to affect European consumers, right? In terms of the price response.
Yeah.
But coming to a slightly related topic, do you think that the EU is doing enough? You mentioned once the European Directive for the Just Transition and the reaction of the unions. Do you think the European Union is doing enough to help, help basically alleviate the unemployment during the energy transition? Or do you think more initiatives are needed on that end? Because, the energy transition definitely contributed to higher unemployment in the EU.
Yes, it contributed, of course, to higher unemployment. Yeah, but in Europe, so one of our big challenges, of course, is also that we have, let's say, high social cost. The standards are also high, of course. So it's, but it's let's say the difference, or the gap between the gross and the net salary. Finally, the employees on the one hand get on their accounts, and on the other hand, let's say the gross salaries, where we let's say manage let's say all our services, our social services to our society, and this is this is a big challenge itself. And of course, if then, let's say, energy crisis and energy comes, and energy cost increase, of course it's then much more stress on it, and then let's say all the time. So also in Europe, so the national governments, they intervened, and they implemented price ceilings for gas prices, electricity prices, and so on, where you had some ceiling for the 80% of your let's say consumption, or annual consumption the previous years, and so on. But to some extent, let's say the delta had to be compensated again, and finally the member states, and ultimately, let's say, the taxpayer again implicitly had to compensate for these instruments. So there is all the time then an intervention. So because in many cases we still talk about in Europe about market instruments and so on when implementing something. On the other hand, also, let's say that the consumers and end users, everybody should get access, let's say, to the market. But so whenever there is a stress on it, so it's more or less an intervention and some kind of planning economy. So it's not necessarily the market forces again because you have to mitigate, let's say, the risk and to hedge everything. But ultimately, at the end, again, all this intervention implicitly have to be paid again by the taxpayers or by the end users.
And is this all due to the dependency on fossil fuel imports and the limited number of suppliers that play into hampering the energy transition and switching basically from a more market-based system to a more planned system, planned economy system? Is that due to, the fact that at the beginning there is this limited number of, countries from which the EU imported fossil fuels?
Yeah. So this is all the time, let's say, our European challenge or our problem we had, let's say, in the past. So it was before gas. It was and still is, or was crude oil. Then it was gas, and in the futures it's supposed to be critical raw materials. So we are all the time dependent on these imports and usually, and also in the past, and most probably also in the future, let's say the number of importing or importing, let's say, countries or stakeholders is not necessarily high. So this is what everybody knows. So usually Europe is short, and we have to rely, let's say, on those few. And we have seen it, let's say, in the gas crisis, where the prime ministers, let's say, went to the Gulf region and everywhere and simply tried in the very short term to negotiate, let's say, LNG contracts based on parameters the prime ministers in Europe have been dreaming of. And on the other hand, reality, let's say, what are the parameters, is a little bit different, because they wanted to have, let's say, contracts shorter than 10 years and this and that ingredient. But this is, let's say, not necessarily a default LNG longer term or long term contract. And this is, let's say, the situation everybody knows. So Europe is supposed to be, let's say, short here. And when talking about, let's say, Russian gas, so in Europe, the central and eastern part of Europe, of course, heavily has been dependent and still is a little bit, but in the past was heavily dependent to, for instance, Austria to 80% or more than 80% on Russian gas. And there is only this one, let's say, route. And if you do not diversify your portfolio, you end up in a challenging situation we had in 2022. And every day it was on top of the agenda of in politics of the prime ministers and in Brussels. So how to manage the gas crisis and to overcome the upcoming winter 22-23. So this was, let's say, the daily, let's say, top agenda point in Europe.
Because we're almost running out of time, given where we at our questions. We have many more questions. So let's try to get to the next one. What role do investments in technological advancement have in the energy transition, where there's sufficient investments in R&D?
So definitely not sufficient investments in R&D. And whenever in Europe, let's say, a pilot or a prototype or is implemented, or a bigger project. So all the times, let's say, the companies, the stakeholders, they ask for some kind of let's say subsidy, investment grants, or any kind of financial support. So in Europe, let's say, venture capital mindset, it is not necessarily that established like in other let's say, regions outside Europe. So whenever novel technologies are, let's say, discussed or implemented. So to some extent, the state needs to incentivize and to trigger it with
More R&D.
with more subsidies or something like that. Yeah.
So it seems to me that for our next question, you already addressed some of the aspects. If you have anything to add, that's fine. If not, we can then just go to the next question. So my current question is, it seems to me that successful implementation of policies that foster the transition to more sustainable European economies, policymakers would need a solid understanding about how the economy works. Do you think that ideology and central planning at the EU level hamper the implementation of the energy transition? So some of this has already come up. I realized that. So I don't know if you wanted to mention anything else here. Otherwise, we will go on.
So maybe only 3-4 sentences. So in general, of course, the politicians or policymakers, of course, they know how economies, let's say, work, but in almost all cases, it's intentionally that they want to follow a certain plan. And then we have some kind of, let's say, planning economy, or also driven by ideology or other drivers. Yeah, but it's to some extent, let's say, intentionally driven. And in many cases, when they talk about markets or market instruments, it's it's finally it's all the time some kind of let's say expected hedging in Europe of the stakeholders that finally the state hedges the risk or compensates for the risk, or they call for let's say auctions. So in the capacity markets, so there are not necessarily free risky investments in the energy business. So all the time somehow the state should let's say somehow cover the risk.
Okay. So our next question is very exciting, I think. To what extent are the need for critical minerals and renewable energy imports from China lead to a new, different kind and possibly more dangerous dependence of the EU on a foreign country?
Yes, so in terms of critical raw materials, so now recently the Critical Raw Material Act was let's say published and implemented, and Europe realized already that we are very, very late. So maybe too late again compared, let's say, to other regions outside Europe, So here, the first time we talk again about, let's say, goals in 2030 or targets in 2030 about extraction, processing, or mining, extraction, processing, and so on. So nobody could imagine a couple of years ago, so maybe before 2022, that in Europe we open up again a mine, let's say, for minerals or something like that, because we all the time thought, okay, mining industry is something we have done in the past in the context of fossils. But now there are certain goals again. And recently in March, a list of 47 projects already was published. So mainly the value chain of batteries for electric vehicles, where we in Europe at least, let's say, learn again to understand the entire value chain, and to do, let's say, or to deliver at least small fractions for the demand, or the demand we need, let's say, in the future for this energy transition, that it takes place in Europe, within the footprint of Europe again. But we are heavily dependent also in this field, so from exporting countries outside China, or platinum, as far as I understand, the platinum market. So South Africa plays a significant role. So in the short to medium term, and so on. And here again, so the full or the entire story starts again, how it started, let's say, with natural gas a few decades ago, and also with crude oil and so on. Now with the critical raw materials, and we want to at least let's say cover certain shares along the entire value chain within the European footprint, and also here, in addition to that, so Europe again has ambitious goals with recycling and remanufacturing based on scraps, maybe on solar modules and so on. But this again is, let's say, a very ambitious, let's say, and these are exercises for the day after tomorrow and not exercises for today or tomorrow and so on. But there are already plans also, let's say, to a certain extent in the longer term to understand, let's say, recycling and remanufacturing based on scrap of renewable technologies. But
Mm-hmm.
there are ambitious, let's say, targets and goals. But so I think first now we need to solve our challenges we have right now, today, and tomorrow.
So I will skip about our Austrian question for now. Although I have to tell our audience we can go 5-10 minutes beyond the hour if needed, if there will be more questions. So we will not cut short on the question. We will still give you a chance for your questions. So my next question is about the changing political environment in the US, in the world, and in Europe, as we see compared to pre-pandemic, we have different kind of political orientation. To what extent do you think that might influence, if at all, the EU energy policy in the coming years? Will that have an effect, or do you think things will mainly follow the same path without any major changes?
So I think in general, so how it also was in the past, of course, whenever there are significant, let's say, changes outside Europe, like the Inflation Act, so in the US and so on, of course, Europe also responds to it. But the major, let's say, cornerstones of the European energy and climate policy, I think, will not change, because this is also what policy making clearly understood from the stakeholders and the associations, that there needs to be a stable, let's say, regulation and policy environment, because otherwise you have this regulatory risk and nobody, let's say, adapts. So therefore, I think in general, the EU policy might not change, let's say, significantly. But if there are, let's say, again, some kind of disruptions or critical events or serious changes outside, of course, they have to switch again to much more, let's say, planning economy, like we had in 2022. So after the gas crisis, so nobody, officially we talked about the market, but it was quite, let's say, energy planning, how to overcome the critical, let's say, periods. And this is costly, of course, at the end, let's say, for society or for the taxpayer. And but I think in Europe now, the point of no return, let's say, has been reached, and they really want to switch to this net zero, let's say, solution. So as cheap as possible, but
yes.
Yeah, most probably a little bit more expensive compared, let's say, to other kind of, let's say, policies you could implement. Let's say it like that.
So as a final question, as a professor at Austria's most renowned technical university, I have to ask you about the Austrian situation, but if you can make your answer a little bit short, because we want to give a chance to the Q&A.
So in Austria, honestly speaking, so already in the past, or after the Second World War, so in the second half of the 20th century, we built a lot of hydropower, and we have 2/3 of our electricity generation. So right now is already let's say, established hydropower, and therefore in the electricity sector, it is not that challenging, let's say, to decarbonize. So we have, of course, certain shares now, mainly gas-fired power plants, combined cycle gas fired CCGTs, and of course here we also have the question how to, in the longer term, to decarbonize. It's biomethane, if it's hydrogen, so. But these are minor, let's say, kind of questions. And in the other sectors, we significantly switch to electricity. Also, the industrial sector, also the steel industry, and so on. So we are embedded, let's say, in the European system, surrounded also by, let's say, established, let's say, economies. So the challenge for Austria is. There are challenges, but it's manageable. Let's say it like that. And decarbonization is also possible in the next 15 to 20 years.
And I would guess, and I don't know your opinion on this, to have 2/3 of electricity powered by hydropower makes our grid more stable than on the Iberian island.
Yes, so this is, let's say, the discussion about the rotating mass. So you have let's say, the turbines and the generators and the inertia of them. So this is not necessarily a disadvantage. Let's say it like that.
Yes.
So in the system, yeah.
But thank you so much for everything. And now we will open the Q&A. So I will give our audience a few seconds or minutes to submit some questions through the Q&A. Please go ahead. If you have any questions for Professor Auer, put them in the Q&A. So I have one more question about the phasing out of gas in the residential sector in Austria. If you could elaborate a little bit on that while we wait, if we get any more questions here.
Yeah. So in order to understand this a little bit in the residential sector, somebody or I'd like to explain how it began. So Austria has two sort of Russian gas. So in the east, then was let's say forwarded 90% to Western Europe, so to Germany and so on, and to the south to Italy. So there are these two big transnational cross-border pipelines. And in the surroundings, of course, of these pipelines in the provinces, residential gas supply emerged and was established 40 years ago or so. But it's not necessarily all over the country where domestic gas supply has been, let's say, established. We have many standalone oil ovens in Austria. Or in the past, so now it's already a little bit decarbonized, mainly with heat pumps. But there have been the same amount of oil ovens compared to residential gas customers. So therefore, the share rather was, I think it was around 30% or so, or a bit more, but only 1/3, and not more compared to the entire residential sector. And now there is the ambition, so in dense areas in cities, to switch to, on the one hand, district heating or heat pumps. So via district heating, or let's say in neighborhoods, to run, let's say, bigger heat pumps and so on. And also in those parts where you have biomethane potentials that you try to decarbonize, let's say the gas grid for residential customers, and let's say fuel it with CO2-free gases. But there is, let's say, it was a political decision, let's say more or less, also in 2022 that we more or less want to completely phase out whenever it's possible from residential gas supply.
So we have one more question here. I think it's going to be our last one. Do you think sentiment on the energy transition, specifically in finance, has started to reassess its outlook? How do you believe this will affect the transition, and will sentiment change?
Yeah, to some extent, it changed already in our areas, so that let's say the conditions. So this started also with the green taxonomy, let's say regulation in 2020. So as an let's say follow-up discussion already of the implementation of the Green Deal. So in those days, the green taxonomy was on the one hand to get access to all the CO2 free, let's say, technologies. So on the one hand, the renewables, and we also had, of course, in Europe, in this context, the big nuclear discussion, because this also was the taxonomy was also or is foreseen also for nuclear technology, and I think this was the starting point in 2020 that let's say in the finance sector, or that there is, let's say, a trust in the European policies that they want to stick to this path. And this also is, or underpins the answer of my last question, Isabella, what you asked me, if I think if European policies might significantly change or deviate. So my answer was no, because this is already let's say aligned also and underpinned with the Draghi report to reform the bank and the finance sector, and let's say to align everything and to remove all these fragmentations.
Well, Professor Hans, I thank you so much for sharing all your insights with us. And I learned a lot today.
Yeah.
And I hope our audience did too. And I thank you so much. And I wish you a good rest of the day. And I give it over to Rebecca.
IAEE would like to thank both Hans Auer and Isabella Ruble for an outstanding webinar. This webinar will be available on IAEE's website for future download. We'll be sending a survey to all webinar attendees. We'd really appreciate your feedback. We thank you for attending, and I officially close this webinar.